Hello, everyone. So wonderful that you're all able to join us tonight. I am Nazrin Himada. I am curator here at Plug-in Institute of Contemporary Art, which is located on Treaty 1 territory. The territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Treaty 1 was signed in 1871, taking this territory from 7 local Anishinaabe First Nations in order to make the land available for settler use and ownership. Plug-in is an institution, and institutions are fraught places historically conditioned by the colonial structures that create them for settler use and ownership. Here at Plug-in, we are thinking and feeling through this as we recognize the ways in which art institutions continue to contribute to the settler colonial narrative and embody its politic. As curator working in such an institution, I acknowledge the limitations that I might come up against, and I continue to ask myself, what are the commitments of Plug-in when it comes to decentering settler narratives and knowledge? What changes am I able to implement in my position? What are my responsibilities and priorities? And how are they motivated by the possibilities that open up when structural transformation is at the heart of the work that is to be done and that must be done? The art that I love is one that troubles our understanding of the world, one that shifts our ways of being in order to transform, work that moves us toward accountability, to be accountable to each other and to the promises we make, to put us to task in order to implement change. I hope, and in my capacity to do so, these changes will not be symbolic, and are not reduced to superficial modes of inclusivity or diversity, but are concrete and ongoing. This means that as curator of Plug-in, I will continue to center the work of Indigenous artists, Black artists, artists of color, whose contribution to contemporary art is vast, has a long history, and continues to rock the foundations of colonial settler provenance. Here at Plug-in, we aim to showcase programs and exhibitions that not only challenge us or encourage us to ask questions differently, but move us toward new connections, collectivities, feelings never felt before, new imaginings of otherworldly existence that give life to possibility within what often seems impossible. So it is with great pleasure and excitement that I introduce our first online event as part of the Prairie Art Book Fair 2020 program. The fair is the second iteration, but our first time going virtual. The fair is composed of 2 parts, as a series of online readings, workshops, and events, starting tonight and ending on the 13th, and as web pages, compiling a selection of artists, writers, and publishers from the prairies and beyond that will be highlighted throughout the month of September and October. To explore the work of the 2020 Prairie Art Book Fair online exhibitors and to know more about our programming, please link to plugin.org. I also want to remind all our viewers tonight that you can ask questions through our Facebook chat, or you can email them to questions@plugin.org. As I mentioned, tonight is our opening event, and it is, I'm very excited and super pleased to be introducing our first speaker, the Toronto-based writer, Cason Sharpe, who will be presenting to us an art book show and tell. Cason is one of my favorite writers. He's the author of Our Lady of Perpetual Realness, a book of stories published by Metatron Press. Cason's most recent essay titled The Last Dance was just published in Canadian Art Online and took up the much celebrated documentary on basketball player Michael Jordan and his influence on contemporary art, fashion, film, and music. In the last year or two, Cason has used the form of the email newsletter as a way to publish and disseminate his writings, and those newsletters have brought such joy into my reading life and provided a way to experience writing done differently. I'm in awe of Cason's capacity to consistently experiment with form, and he's here tonight to speak to us about the form of the art book. What is an art book? How does one judge an art book? And Cason will attempt to unravel the opaque definition of the art book, gesturing towards the political potential of the medium along the way. Cason, I'm so happy you were able to join us tonight, and welcome to the Prairie Art Book Fair.
Hey everyone, thank you Nazran for that really thoughtful introduction. It really meant a lot. And thank you for everyone at Plug-in for inviting me to do this. Scott and Colby and Allison, our tech wizards, for facilitating this and making it happen. I'm really happy to be here. It's kind of a dream to be able to get nerdy about art books and to have this platform to be able to do it. So I'm really grateful to be here. And thank you for everyone for tuning in. I don't know how everyone is feeling, but for me, it's been a long week on top of a series of long weeks that I think we've all collectively been experiencing. So I just wanted to kind of do something a little chill and relaxing and low-key. So there's not going to be a test at the end of this talk. I'm just going to go through some books that I really like and some of the formal strategies involved in them. So I thought maybe at first I'd do a little introduction about who I am. My name's Cason, as Nazrin mentioned. I'm a writer based in Toronto. And I've been kind of in and around art books for maybe like 10 years now. I started going to zine fairs and book fairs as a teenager, and then I had my first book of short stories published in my early 20s, Our Lady of Perpetual Realness, with Metatron Press, which is a small press based in Montreal. And sort of through the writing community in Montreal, I met a lot of artists and writers who were working with art books. And then most recently, I just recently left Art Metropole, which is an artist-run center based in Toronto that works with the art book form, distributing and circulating and promoting various art books. So I've been in and around the art book world for a while, but kind of accidentally. I didn't even realize like how enmeshed in it I was until I looked at my bookshelf and I was like, oh God, I have a lot of these themes and like little books. And I didn't even realize that I had them. And so now I want to talk a little bit about what exactly I mean when I say art book, maybe explain some terms a little bit. So kind of the loose definition that I have of an art book, so I'm looking at my little phone notes here, is an object where the book is the art. So it is in opposition to something like, I don't know, there's this Saul Bellow book that is just right here on my coffee table. Great book of short stories, but the book itself is kind of the packaging for the ideas, whereas the books that I'm going to talk about, the book as the form is inextricable from the ideas that are contained within the book. And to kind of explain what I mean by that a little bit more, and to maybe shed some light on that, what I'm going to do is show 6 books in groups of 2, so I've paired them off, and I'm just going to kind of compare the formal and conceptual strategies in each book, in these pairs of books. So again, nothing too intense, just relax and let me show you some books. So we'll get started. The first 2 books that I'm going to show are these little tiny pocket books. One is called Gates of Memory by Patience Strong, and the other one is called It Is So Green Outside, It Is Difficult to Leave the Window by Sheila Weekly. If we can have the first image of Gates of Memory. So this book was published in 1954 originally. By Frederick Mueller is the publisher. Here's the cover image. And it's a book of poems by the poet Patience Strong. And then it's also interspliced with these images of the English countryside that were taken by a couple. Their names are Vera and Humphrey Joel. And Caisson Strong as a poet is very, she's almost like Emily Dickinson. They're like these little prose poems that are written in these little couplets. But unlike Emily Dickinson, she kind of has none of the bite. It's all very like gentle, kind of saccharine poems about rural life and a devotion to God and kind of idealizing the pastoral. So I'll give you an example of one of the poems. This is the first poem. It's called The Gates of Memory. When I lift the latch upon the gates of memory, I find I am surrounded with a happy company, of friends and dear ones loved and lost, They crowd around my way and beckon me to follow down the path of yesterday. The present seems to vanish, for the past is real again, the sunny times, the stormy times, the pleasure and the pain. But soon my mind is haunted by lost dreams and vain regret, remembering things that I have wanted to forget. Close the gates of memory, come back, my heart, come back. You dare not go far along that old forgotten track. Keep sacred every well-loved name, but cling not to the sorrow. Go where God is leading you toward a bright tomorrow. And as we can see in this image here, the images are all these kind of very idyllic pictures of the English countryside. There's that one, that picture there is a picture of a cathedral. And there's also, I can show you this image of rolling hills. And so what we have with the images of the photos and then the imagery within the poems is kind of this really idyllic pastoral version of like English countryside life. There's a lot of poems about flower arrangements that are beautiful and having gratitude and, you know, living a humble life for God. And I found this book, interestingly, earlier this summer when I was at my roommate's cottage in one of the local town's consignment store, thrift store. And so I thought, what a funny little colonial connection to find this little book of like English pastoral poems in kind of this colonized cottage country. And the next book that I'll introduce that kind of goes along with it, if you can have the cover for that one shown, it's called It Is So Green Outside, It Is Difficult to Leave the Window by Sheila Weekly. And I thought of it when I came across Gates of Memory because they're both, as you can see, similar small pocket books, black and white. Whereas Gates of Memory is mostly about the poems and there's maybe 5 or 6 images, this one is all about the images and there's maybe 5 or 6 poems in it. And so what this book is, it's a collection of photographs that the artist Sheila Weekly took over the course of 5 years of an outdoor garden space she had. And we can see there, and if we can go to the next image maybe of, you can see that there's these pictures of her garden, of her courtyard, and then these little prose reflections on the garden. And they're photos that she took over the course of 5 years. But when they're put together in this book, it gets kind of a time-lapse effect going on, where you can see the evolution of the garden over a long period of time, but happening really quickly, sequentially, if you just like flip through. And what's interesting about this book to me is the garden and courtyard is really tiny. There's like a big brick wall behind her, and there's this table and chairs, and that's pretty much it. And over the 5 years, her and her flatmates are shifting around these tables and chairs, and they can't seem to quite get it right. And this little book was also presented, it's by Coracle Press. They're a small press in London. They also have a gallery. And so this book was presented alongside with a showing of all of these photographs of her garden throughout the 5-year process. And so I'll read a little example of what her prose is like. The tables and chairs did not belong, some of the pots of geraniums. This made the garden how it should be, a shady outdoor room. It was like a room with the walls and overhanging trees. Indeed, it had originally been thought of as almost indoors. That is why there were high fences, some of the plants in pots, and the built-up stones at the end like seats. The table and chairs completed it. And then she goes on, things were placed with apparent precision. Another arrangement could not tell the particular tale more rightly. In fact, they were merely reminders, not carefully selected, just used and left. A response was demanded as much as it had been carefully arranged. Reflection was required rather than intrusion. It seemed improper to spoil the reverie, for entering would surely change it. And so she has kind of all of these anxieties throughout the course of the book about how the table and chairs are being changed around, and the photographs reflect this kind of ongoing anxiety. It's like when you can't quite figure out the right configuration of furniture in a room. And the last part of the book says, the table had turned from white to almost black. It was a natural course of change and aging, nothing added or removed. It took 5 years. It might have been an evening. So I was thinking kind of about this book in relation to Gates of Memory and kind of the idyllic pastoral imagery outlaid here, and then kind of this slow domestic destruction that happens here where she can never quite get the table and chairs placed how they want, and in the end, the table falls apart. And I was thinking, what's the similarities between these two books that are like so formally similar? What's the conversation happening here? And I thought, I looked at the publication date, and this Sheila Weekly book was published in 1980, whereas Gates of Memory is from the early 50s. And they're both from London. And so there's maybe this interesting conversation, maybe I'm reading into it, but 1980 is the beginning of the rise of Thatcher in England. And so I think like Patience Strong puts out this image of a beautiful pastoral godly England, and then Sheila Weekly, kind of at the beginning of the rise of Thatcher's England, kind of starts to deconstruct that idea a bit. And I thought it was interesting to have these two books that invoke such similar strategies formally, but kind of to very different ends conceptually. So that's the first two books that I have. And the next two, actually, I'm going to pause for a moment and grab my computer charger because I'm a little nervous that my computer is going to die. So just give me 1 second. Thanks for bearing with me. Awesome. Thanks for bearing with me there. I appreciate it. Again, I'm taking everything slow and gentle these days. That's all I can do. So the next book I'm going to talk about, the next two books, one is Solange's A Seat at the Table, and the next is Consciousness by Lex Brown. So I don't know if it's possible to show the first image of A Seat at the Table. So this book, A Seat at the Table, was published in 2016 by Antiism Books in Montreal. And they're actually one of the organizers of Volume, which is an art book fair that happens in Montreal. I believe it's going on its 3rd year in this fall. And so most of you probably know Solange, Beyonce's little sister. She's a recording artist. And this book, A Seat at the Table, was created as a visual accompaniment for her album, A Seat at the Table. And so it includes photography, and then so half the book is photography from the visual album that accompanied A Seat at the Table, with photography by Camille Carrero, who's a Spanish photographer, who art directed the visual album. And then the second half of the book is poetry and lyrics from the album. So what I kind of think of this book as is like the way that liner notes would function in vinyl. So there's like an interior part of the album that goes along with it, but isn't the actual album itself. And this book, it's a beautiful, like cloth-bound hardcover book, and it's a tête bêche, which means a head-to-tail book. So basically, it's 2 books in one, and I kind of really obsess over these things. I'm like a child when I see a Tet Besh book. It's so interesting to me. So you read it regularly, left to right, just like normal. And then when you get to the middle of the book, it switches, and then you switch the book, and you can read it from the opposite way. So there's almost two books in one that you read halfway through, and then you flip it upside down and read it again. And so it's a really cool bookbinding technique that I always really love. And what I love about the way that A Seat at the Table is done is all of this photography, which is gorgeous. You can maybe show some here. Is really given room to breathe. And then that was the one that was shown earlier. And if you're familiar with A Seat at the Table, the album and the visual album, you'll recognize some of these shots and images from the videos. And then when you flip the Tet Besh around and go to the other side, it's all these lyrics. I don't know if you can go to the third or fourth image in the Seat of the Table kind of presentation, but all of the poetry here is laid out like poetry concrete. So instead of trying to translate her lyrics into just direct poetry, she visualizes it on the page, which I think makes a more interesting reading experience. Because reading songs is never quite the same experience as listening to them. So in this way, by using the poetry concrete form, Solange can kind of create some semblance of what it's like listening to her music while just looking at the lyrics. And the next book that I'm going to take a look at is Consciousness by Lex Brown, if we can show the cover of that one. This book was published by Genderfail Press in New York. They're a really interesting small press that's been publishing a lot of interesting work, I think. And this book I've been particularly drawn to because I haven't seen anything like it before. Lex Brown is a multidisciplinary artist based in Brooklyn. She does video work, she's a musician, she has a band, she's a singer, and she does video work. And this book is a compilation, like a survey of her video, performance, and music work from 2011 to 2019. So it's a pretty broad sweeping survey for a pretty thin book. It's maybe about 150 pages. And what it comprises of, her song lyrics are kind of the narrative spine of the book, which, see, my copy is kind of falling apart, but you can see all of the lyrics of her songs are kind of laid out like poetry. And then all of that is interspersed, if we can go to the next image, with imagery from her video work, and also film stills, photos from her performances. And so what you get is kind of a really holistic look at her performance, of her like artistic practice overall. And it's separated into 9 sections, but they're not what you think. It covers 9 years of her work. There are 9 sections. It should be chronological, but it's not chronological. It's separated kind of loosely by theme. So the image that you see there, everyday life, is one of the themes of the book. And so there's no kind of differentiation between Lex Brown's early work and her later work. They're all jumbled up in one, which I think is really interesting because it denies this narrative of kind of this constant artistic progression. Instead, it's just like this swirling mass of different images and thoughts. And obviously a lot of her song lyrics, as song lyrics tend to be, are really repetitive. And she kind of circles back to the same themes a lot. And so instead of becoming this neat narrative of like, Lex Brown started here and ended here, the book kind of totally disavows that. And instead is like, Lex Brown is thinking about this sometimes, and she's thinking about this sometimes, which I really enjoyed as a reader, to kind of see that circularity of someone's process. And you can kind of make it out in that image. I don't know if you can see here, but if I hold it up. But the pages are printed on these kind of semi-transparent pages, so you can see the traces of poems and song lyrics in behind each page. So it's sort of like this slipperiness, this porousness that exists throughout the book. And it's called consciousness, and I think a lot of what Lex Brown is doing in her work is kind of deconstructing a Black consciousness and what it means to have a Black consciousness and a Black subjectivity. And so she's circling, it kind of operates, the book operates like how a mind operates. You know, you're going on one tangent and then you're going on another and you're building another. And I think it's an interesting way to translate what she's working out in live performance into a book by making it really circular and kind of messy as a book. And I'll read one poem, which is now up on the screen. She's a very funny lyricist. A lot of the poems are satire. And so this one, let me see if I can. It's a Drake cover. It's a cover of Drake's Worst Behavior. And she says, Ciabatta on my big sub, ciabatta on my big sub. You ain't know, now you know now. Curated food costing $20. Chips nigga still eating those old chips, but your chips in that tiny ass little flat Lay's bag. Nigga, we don't eat chips. Flexing nigga, I just flexing. Ciabatta on my big sub. You think it needs dressing? Look at you, and look at you. I'm glad they chose us, because it's a mission. Trying to bite the finish just to see them all finish on my worst behavior, no? So it's this kind of funny subversion of kind of the expectation of Black hardness, and sort of the expectations of rap culture, but also blended with her reality as a Brooklyn-based performance artist and living this kind of bougie life where she's eating ciabatta subs. And so what I really like about this book and like about Lex Brown's practice is that there's a lot of self-interrogation. She's constructing this messy Blackness throughout the book that is willing to call itself out, that's not perfect, and then that's also not resolved. And I think as an artist, that's a really powerful statement to make, to not have some definitive statement about Blackness, but still want to interrogate Blackness within your work. And so I was thinking about what the connection between these two books were, between A Seat at the Table and Consciousness. And I think it's almost the opposite of what we had with Gates of Memory and the Sheila Wakely book, where they're using very different formal strategies. So Solange has kind of this Besh style, and it's very controlled, very separated, where like the photos are just on one side and the text on another. Whereas Lex Brown is kind of messier, everything is all jumbled together, but they're both to the same end, which is to find some way in book form to translate live and community-based performance. So Solange had a live album that involved a lot of other musicians, involved, this art director who kind of really sculpted the visual album, as well as a lot of models who appeared in the visual album. And so it was really like a collective practice, and it's also something that's not easy to translate into book form, like how do you write music out? And same with Lex Brown, she works mostly live in performance venues, video work, and so a lot of the work depends on having an audience to play off of and work with. And so I thought these books were two interesting ways of kind of trying to translate the idea of like live communal performance and live art and collective art and music within the book form, which doesn't always permit that kind of one-to-one documentation. And the last guys that I'm going to shout out here, I wanted to end with Beans, because that's how I kind of got started in my interest in art books. And so I picked these two beans out of my like big collection. The first one is called Presumpscot. It's by Olivia Wood. And the second is called Scorcher. It's by Max Steele. And so Presumpscot, this is issue 2, which is a common thing for zines. A lot of them will be serialized. Presumpscot is a series of zines about grief. And Olivia Wood is a Montreal-based poet and who's originally from Portland. And so a lot of the zines center around this idea of grief in migration. So this idea of mourning both people and places. And so a lot of, it's mostly poetry, but then it has these collage backgrounds that exist throughout. And if we go to the second Presumpscot image, there we go. So what I found interesting about Olivia's approach is that she's kind of embedding these new media things into the zine. So here she's cut and paste a screenshot from a Word document like directly into the zine. And it's this really funny melding of new media technologies and then also old school cut and paste, like the way that zines, and this zine in particular, is made is by a technique of cutting and pasting lines and then Xeroxing them, which is originally how magazines were created. It's a very old type of technique, and so I really like that mixing of medium in this small little zine. And if we can go to the last image of Presumpscot, the other thing that I really like about this is, as a zine about mourning both people and places, she's embedded a bunch of ephemera from Portland into the zine. So here we have some crumpled up bits of house show flyers from punk shows that have been collaged into these pages and then Xeroxed into the zine. And I like the way that sound works. Kind of resonates with the themes of the poetry. And I'm going to read one poem. This zine was from, I think, 2014, 2015. I can remember, it's harder with zines because there's no archival trails. There's no information online about this. And so kind of my own scholarship has had to be from memory. So I remember the apartment that I lived in and what I was going through when this zine came to me, but I don't quite remember the year. So it was 2014, 2015, I believe. But I'm going to read one poem from it so you get an idea of what it was like. This is called Tourist. On the second day of the siege at Bastille, rain turned to the stonework black. Do you prefer discipline or consistency? The university stop smells like bread, all in your green corduroy dress to impress him. You look like a philosophy professor. You look like a philosophy professor's mistress. Which do you prioritize, analysis or deference? A tall glass of Chardonnay asleep on the head of the railing, the apple tree rotting in the yard. In Canada, you can take a metro to a clinic and receive services. Veterans and expats and women with patches over their eyes who may be both, alike in the collection hall. She needs at least 3 men to tell her how terribly they want her at any given moment for it to register. This is indefensible, but actually true. Items change from instance to instance. List the facts again, you charming, deathless, long-fingered girl. We fall helplessly into Canada, kitten-field in the Immigration Services lobby. Petroleum, wait, it is so civil, there are so few guns. Primary colors make us glow in silence, docile in the democratic hour. I need my prescription. We fall helplessly into bed with him again. We don't even like him, though he smelled like paint thinner, and when he breathed near me, my nipples hardened, actually, in the dark, on the high open porch, in the strange fall wind, but it doesn't mean I like him. Cream linen suit in zone dolissement, walk gracefully into the pulse tone. We don't mind waiting. They inflect the concept in a series of gestures. Each place is a social world. Did you take that for granted? Did you think you could walk right in? Many locals accept beautiful women, but some will not. In the case of international bilingual love affairs, occasional reactives slip into French in moments of surprise or total ease. The infrequent but powerful urge for Big Dick at the New England drive-in. How could you understand? The traveler returns home worldly, having eaten figs and poutine in bed, the sheen of discomfort all over their visage. You were never really there. You will return a waitress, a secretary, a student, a night girl, a risk, a betrayer still, now more familiar with your limitations, your hatred, your little slinking capacity to hail a cab in a new language, to laugh, to call yourself American, prudent, traitor. The stakes are not the same for you, you non-citizen. It is not your town they will burn, with only gulls to hear the sizzling. Pretty powerful stuff. The next zine I'm going to talk about is called Scorcher. This is Scorcher number 5, I believe. Oh no, issue 4. It's by Max Steele. He's a performance artist and musician based in California now, I believe. And Scorcher, in Scorcher, he describes it as a psychedelic porno poetry zine. And he adopts this character called Billy Cheer. This issue is called Be Billy. And basically Billy goes around and has all of these kind of sexual exploits with various men around this fictional town called Fag City. And Billy is this trickster character, so in his meetings and dealings with these men, he often exposes their hypocrisy or kind of their, like, the underbelly of gay sexual relations. And I got this zine as a teenager. I found Max Steele Blogspot, it was MySpace, like in the early 2000s. And I used to order these zines to my house and like would get tracking on the delivery and like try to beat my dad to the mailbox so he wouldn't find me with all of these like gay punk, sexually explicit zines. And it's like now Max Steele and I are like internet friends, as these things often happen, and it's this funny thing where I'm like, oh, you're the guy who wrote these little zines that I used to like covet when I was 16. And so I'll read a little bit of the beginning of Be Billy. In the beginning, there was a nerve. The next day, a button to press it with. She fed and slept. First, she grew a finger to trigger the button. Then she grew another 9. Yawning, purpose and circuit complete, she could take her time. I'm thinking about you, and the lights are turning purple. I'm cutting off their blood, they're gasping, and I'm holding my breath, lover. I know you'll be back, I'm just counting backwards from 27 to 1. My boyfriend died. He turned into a phantom, that means ghost, so that's how I know how he's dead. Listen, Billy is a romantic. Billy means romance in some language, so when you say Billy, you're calling for romance. Billy used to be a real boy. He is from Nevada City or something. Some Californian pregnant teen city, military children's city. Like me, the city before Fag City. I met Billy. He ruined my life for one whole summer. Then I moved to Fag City and I became Billy. I don't know where he is now. The same probably. I'm Billy in California and I'm Billy in NYC and I'm Billy in Fag City. Now I am Billy, and you can be too. Being Billy is being plural. And so Max Steele's kind of creative process is really inflected by a lot of new narrative writers like Kathy Ecker. There's a lot of references to her work, Hello, I'm Arif Kajong, throughout the zine, which are references I did not pick up on as a teen, but now revisiting it, I was able to note that. And so I was thinking about the connections between these two works. And here it's a little bit more obvious than the other ones. They're both these 8.5 by 11 Xerox zines. They use like similar techniques formally in that way. If we can go to the next Scorcher slide, if possible. You can see that Max Steele also does that cut and paste technique. So they're Word documents that he has cut out and then pasted onto these different pages, which are then Xerox, which is the same technique that Olivia uses in Presumpscott. And it creates this page layout, which is you can't replicate in literature, where you have like the rough outlines where you can see the pasting job. And I kind of love the way that that looks. And the other thing that I noticed between these two is that I'm not going to dox Olivia here, so I'll hold it up to the screen to hold some fingers over. She has her email address and her actual home address on the zine. And same here with Max Steele. He has an email address and a blog spot there where you can contact him. And that's a common thing with zines a lot of times because they're self-published, they're intimate, they're for like limited distribution and kind of a way of networking and creating contact that people will include their full their full address in a zine. And I kind of wanted to end on this note because zine publishing is, I think, a really important facet of art book publishing. And both of these zines and like numerous others, I have like a whole drawer full of these kind of little Xerox zines, often fell into my lap through these kind of happenstance community building ways. So for Presumpscott, I had a friend who was reading at the launch, and I didn't know Olivia at the time, and now I do. But it was a way of connecting with her, and I was going through an experience of grief when the zine came to me, and so it came to me in this kind of very helpful moment to meet someone else who had like been having similar experiences. And as I mentioned with Max Steele's work, like I was kind of coveting these like young, isolated gay teen, and to be able to have this zine and a point of connection with someone else was really important and formative. And I used to make a lot of these zines myself, and I think the reason for doing so is they're so low overhead. You can just go to any Kinko's and print them like really fast and cheap, distribute them among your friends, and it's a way to meet people and to build community. And I think like it made me think a lot about the recent kind of controversy that happened at the Whitney, where there was like a lot of taking of these ephemeral materials. And I felt, and kind of showcasing them in an art way to maybe an audience that wasn't a part of the community that they came from. And I felt sort of, even though I was removed from that whole controversy, like almost personally offended because I know the kind of vulnerability that it takes to make an object like this and to distribute it among people and to put yourself out there in such a vulnerable position that you would put your home address on one of these things, and then to have it put into a museum is kind of without your permission, it's unsettling. And I also wanted to encourage people to continue making these kind of zines because I feel like sometimes I think like, oh, I'm too old or too mature to like make a zine now, like I'm a capital W writer. That's not what I should be doing, but I think there is real value in those kind of grassroots publications that are accessible for artists to make and also accessible for communities to have. And that is pretty much it. I did want to end by saying if you are interested in those like last couple of zines that I mentioned and zine distribution more widely, to check out Brown Recluse zine distribution. They're Brown people of color focused zine distribution center based out of Oakland that are taking a lot of these smaller zines with low overhead from a lot of like emerging artists and finding ways to distribute them among bigger networks. So if that's something that you're interested in, definitely check out Brown Recluse zine distribution. Thanks everyone for listening in. I really appreciate it. This was such a joy. You might be able to tell I kind of really nerd out about these things. I'm really passionate about it. And so it's been such a joy to have the opportunity to think through these ideas with all of you. And now I'll bring Nazrin back if there's any questions.
Hey.
Hey.
Thank you so much, Cason. That was so lovely. It did feel like we were relaxing with you in your living room, looking at those books together. So, and to have you also read from them, that was really, really nice. I'm not seeing any questions coming in yet, but I thought I would just get us started. Maybe just ask a couple. I know you don't want to use up too much of your time. But yeah, I'm just wondering if I could, for a second, maybe nerd out with you when you're writing, because I feel like...
That was so much when you talked about my newsletter. I was so flattered.
Oh yeah, it's really one of my favorite things, honestly. So I'm just maybe to let people know more about it. I guess we could start there. Yeah. Where the idea came to you to kind of use the e-newsletter format to distribute and publish your own writings, because it is in a way taking up that form of self-publishing, but it's also quite different. And I also really, again, admire the ways in which you use a kind of, you let us in through a personal lens, but then use that to really create an analytic framework toward some of the things you talk about. And it's anything from art to music to news headlines. Yeah, so I feel like I'd love to hear more about the process and
I think it started because kind of almost what I was talking about with the zines, where like I felt this pressure to kind of professionalize and to have my work in like various publications and kind of try to build my professional resume. But I also felt like I wanted to experiment with my writing, and I felt that there wasn't really a space within the institution to do that. The institution being like the publishing industry in this case. And so I wanted a way to be able to experiment and to try new things without that professional anxiety kind of looming overhead. And also trying to, I think, obviously it's important for artists and writers to get paid for their work, and that I think goes without saying. And it's like part of my ethics, but also I kind of came to art and writing as someone who just really liked doing it for the doing of it. And so I wanted to challenge myself to be able to do something and not have it be all about money, and not have it be necessarily something that I was just doing for money or that I had to put a price tag on. And I also had I missed blog culture, and it's part of it's how I found Max Steele was through Blogspot, and I used to follow a lot of people on these various platforms that were more diaristic and long form, which I think in the social media platforms that we engage with now, they're bite size, and they're also, there's a whole conversation to be had about the way that these 3 or 4 companies kind of control all of our creative output. So as much as using Instagram or Twitter can be a creative outlet, it also, it goes towards generating an algorithm to sell you things, and your tweets could be used against you or used towards ends that you didn't necessarily intend them to be. So I kind of wanted to escape the platforms in a way, which I use MailChimp, and MailChimp is another platform, so it's a bit of a moot point, but yeah, that's kind of where I was coming from with it, where I wanted this space to play an experiment that was and distribute my work in a way that wasn't these platforms that we were usually using.
Cool, nice. And do you plan on continuing to do it for a while, or?
I don't know, I'm kind of in a place with it now where I'm not sure what to do with it, because I want to continue doing it. I haven't written any over the summer, because I've been busy and backlogged. And I'm kind of wondering, now that I've been doing it for about a year now, and I set out without intention and I didn't know what it was. And now that I kind of have a clear sense of what it is, I feel like I want to kind of put more intention behind it. So I have to kind of think about where I want to go. But I am interested in like the way that the newsletter is distributed and how it's like both intimate and widespread. Like it's direct to people's email boxes.
And quite active, I feel like, too.
Yeah, and people respond and engage and like, but it's all these like nice like one-to-one interactions that you don't usually get, because in a lot of like Instagram or Twitter, like it's a communal space. And so it's nice to like, there's people who I've never really talked with in real life who will email me after reading the newsletter, and we have this like back and forth, and like that to me is like really lovely and special.
Amazing. I wanted to also, I know you wrote the Our Lady of Perpetual Realness, you mentioned in your 20s, and I can't remember how many years ago that is now, because it's not that long ago, is it? Yeah, because I was like, I feel like, anyway, I love that book too, and I love, I know you're still quite young. But I'm wondering, how are you, if you have a new book project on the go, and how you're feeling about having written something in that kind of format. It was just, full of humor, and also was quite, had a critical kind of sentiment to it in terms of just living in Montreal, I think, also at the time. And now I'm just wondering how you feel, where you feel like your book project is taking you next, or how your writing has kind of developed from there, since, because now you're in Toronto, and you also had a full-time job at Art Metropole for a while, and
I think the Our Lady of Perpetual Realness was fiction, but I think only because I wasn't ready to like talk about my life yet, or I hadn't had enough distance from the things that were happening to me to like reflect on them. And so what I ended up doing was like fictionalizing a lot of my own experiences, and like kind of creating composite characters or composite situations. Whereas I think now the fiction that I've been writing is a little bit more removed from myself. It's still like, I think all writers take like a bit from their own lives, but I'm able to kind of synthesize my life experiences in a way that there's not quite the same like direct one-to-one relation. And I've also become interested through the newsletter in writing nonfiction, or kind of experimenting with what nonfiction and what criticism and essays can look like. Because I think when I started the newsletter project, I was kind of under the impression that no one, and I think it is kind of the case in a lot of publications, unfortunately, but like I would be interested in publishing something that's so, that like is a critical lens on something, but it's really personal and subjective. I have like a lot of my newsletters, I'll be talking about a movie, but then I'll have a random tangent about like an experience from childhood. And that's something I was like, I don't know if like Vice wants to publish that, or like if I want to publish that in Vice, like, it was, and so I think the newsletter project has given me the confidence within my new work to play with that a little bit more. And also having kind of worked in art books now for a while and being around that culture, I'm a bit more skeptical of like traditional publishing, which maybe to my own detriment, because I could like try to cash in at like Penguin Random House, but I think like having being around these books that are a little bit more experimental in the way they're presented, I'm also hesitant to work with, I don't want like a team of marketing executives like making any choices about my work and like
Right.
the way it's presented. I feel a little bit suspicious about that. And I think being kind of around art books has really pushed me in that way, where I see people who are like working on things like the writing is a really big part of it, but then also how it's presented is like equally part of it, and I'm interested in exploring that.
Okay, nice. We're getting so many questions in now. So we have a comment slash question maybe. I've thought about the art book potential of social media platforms, or in the artist's ability to use them aesthetically and politically to articulate worlds and ideas that could be thought-provoking beyond the medium. Unfortunately, most artists seem content to use these platforms for promotion or reposting articles. The potential of tapping into art as a mode of engagement outside of normative connections remains underdeveloped, I think. That's the comment. Yeah.
I mean, I agree. I think it, I used to, like for an example, like I used to use Twitter, I think more experimentally when I first got it and was in university and like Twitter was first starting to be a thing. To like, I don't know, play little word games or with myself kind of, or see, because that's like an interesting like conceptual constraint of like you only have so many characters and like what can you do in that space. And I think Twitter used to encourage that a lot more, and now it's become like this networking tool or tool of self-promotion. And so I think there's a lot of ways that these networks like aren't being potentially tapped into. But I also think that doesn't like inhibit artists from using them to those ends or creating new networks. I think like people have done that. Like I think meme culture is a great example of that. That these images are created and circulated so heavily on these platforms by artists, sometimes not credited, and like the whole idea of like meme editing is like an interesting conversation that's kind of evolved out of that. And memes getting like co-opted by corporations. Like there's a whole a tangent to be gone down in that way. But I think like that is happening on networks, just maybe not in the way that we're expecting. And so like maybe it's something like memes or that are creating that generative potential, and maybe it's not going to look like the Xerox zine, just like a one-to-one version on the digital space.
Cool, thank you. There is a question. Thinking about this book fair being online, how do you feel about taking zines or art books themselves online? Do you think that's even possible?
Yeah, I think it is in some contexts. Like I know Printed Matter has released a bunch of resource zines and pamphlets and ephemera for free on their website. As a method of like distribution and like consciousness raising from a lot of like grassroots organizations and artists, which I think is like an interesting initiative. I think I've also seen a turn in the past couple of years with a lot of fairs, in-person fairs becoming more inaccessible and exclusive, and kind of switching to almost an art fair model. With like ticketed events and like really high booth fees to be able to participate, which like excludes a lot of independent artists who may not be able to pay for like table fees or booth fees. And so I think obviously, the pandemic is not a welcome thing, but I think it does provide this silver lining opportunity to be able to reflect on how we gather as people who are interested in like art book materials, and who is included in those like in real life, in real space meetups, and who is potentially excluded from them. And so I don't know if the digital is like a remedy for that, but it's definitely having things have to be put online this year I think pushes people to engage with those questions more and hopefully to create like less exclusive models in the future.
Totally. Yeah. Although I'm sad that, of course, there's a physical component to gathering in spaces that just makes a huge difference. I am really excited for the potential of so many people accessing these live events. Yeah. We have a question. How did you come to writing? How did you find the critical confidence to write the way you do?
I don't know. If I find it, I'll tell you. I guess I was always kind of I went to an arts high school, a public arts high school, and I was kind of surrounded by a lot of people who were interested in the arts. But I flitted around a lot, and I wasn't. It's like that Dr. Seuss book, like "Are You My Mother?" Like I didn't know which thing was for me. I did like a little bit of acting and a little bit of dancing and some photography and some film and nothing quite clicked. And then when I moved to Montreal for school, I started going to readings because my sister is also a writer and a poet. And so I started meeting all of these people, and essentially like they just threw really good parties. And so I started hanging out with them more because they were cool people. And then I kind of came into, I think I started telling people that I was a writer because I had like written some things in a diary and a Word doc. And then I had a friend who was organizing a little show, and he was like, "Oh, you're a writer. Do you want to read at this thing?" And I said yes. And then I kind of like committed to being a writer because I had told enough people that I was. And so I guess like fake it till you make it is kind of my answer.
Amazing. There is a follow-up question too in some ways. What were you reading when you wrote Our Lady of Perpetual Realness? What non-reading activity goes on that helps with your writing?
I'm trying to remember what I read. Oh, I wish I could go grab it, but I don't know where it is. There's this writer, multidisciplinary artist, dancer, musician named Brontes Parnell, who's based in Oakland. He's from Alabama, but he's been in Oakland for, I think, since the early 2000s, and he's kind of like a staple of the punk scene down there. And he had a bunch of zines called Sag School, and those are really informative. And a bunch of them are collected into his memoirs, which is called Johnny, Would You Love Me If My Dick Was Bigger? And that's from the Feminist Press in New York. He's also coming out with a book in 2021 called 100 Boyfriends Mixtape, which should be really good. He's like a black queer punk musician. So I was reading a lot of him, and which I think kind of influenced the like casual tone of the book. And I was watching like a lot of movies. I wrote it between like the ages, like I started the first story when I was 19, and it came out when I was 24. So I was reading a lot because it was over a span of like a long time.
Yeah. Okay, and maybe this will be a good note to end on. What are you reading these days?
Ooh, good question. I am reading, I'm kind of splitting between a couple things. I haven't committed to a book right now. I just got my copy of Faggots by Larry Kramer, who recently passed away, which is like kind of a seminal book of gay contemporary life in New York. And that's been interesting so far. And then I'm reading The Letters of Mina Harker by Dodie Bellamy, which I didn't realize. I just found out through Instagram the other day from a friend of mine that it's been out of print for like many a year, and the publisher, Dodie Bellamy got into some dispute with the publisher and they won't reprint it. I just happened upon a copy in a used bookstore, and I'd been wanting to read it for a while. So I really count myself lucky to have that. And before I was I'm not careful with my books. I don't subscribe to, keeping them in little sleeves or whatever. I take them in the bath, I throw them around. So now I'm trying to be a bit more cautious with that one. Now that I know it's a bit more precious, I'm not leaving it in my bag with like suits anymore.
Right. Yeah, that's totally. I hear you. Yeah, I'm like the opposite. It's like I'm that person who doesn't like lend their books out, or it's like.
I need to become more like that.
Caisson, this was so nice. So great. Thank you so much for your thoughtful responses and your great just presentation of and your reading of the poems. And yeah, it's so nice to have you here and to have you be with us. I do want to just say before everybody takes off, just a few thank yous. The fair came to fruition through a collective effort, and I want to give a big thank you to Luther Canedo, Plugin's public program coordinator, Aaron Josephson Laidlaw, our operations manager, Madeline Defoe, our communications coordinator, Allison Yearwood, our executive director. I also want to thank Broadcast Collective for facilitating our online live stream and creating this platform for us tonight. Thank you so much for everyone who joined. Please don't forget to join us tomorrow at 5 p.m. Central for a reading with Leanne Batsomase Simpson from her recent novel, Nupiming, The Cure for White Ladies. Please do check out the exhibitors for this year's Prairie Art Book Fair and our lineup for our programming this weekend at plugin.org. Thank you again, Caisson, and I can't wait to read whatever you do next.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.